Let's learn how to create sections with Blender. We'll start with an existing building, like the example that we have here, and I will show you how you can create this kind of section. Now, Blender doesn't have a section tool like Rhino, SketchUp, or Revit, so we have to figure out some other ingenious ways to do it. Luckily, Blender has non-destructive modifiers like the boolean modifier, and that's what we'll use. On top of that, with some very easy to use geometry nodes, we can put people in our buildings and they respond to the section cut as well. So let's take a look at how this building massing is built. It basically has 4 objects. It has a core which sits on the inside, which we'll see more of when we cut it, but you can see if we toggle on and off, the floors are just floating in there. And then we have our floors, which are boolean in here. It's done via geometry node, so we can add people onto it. So if we turn off the geometry nodes, that's what it looks like. Then we have our massing, and we have 2 layers of the massing. We have one that's being used as a glass, and then we have the second layer, which has been kind of built up from that point on, which is our facade. So that's it. We've got 4 objects in here. So now let's take this collection of building, duplicate collection, and we will move them somewhere else, like right over here, so they're not duplicating. Let's add a rectangle, so Shift A, Mesh, Plane, go into edit mode by hitting Tab, scale the object up, then E for extrude, make this go quite a bit up, go back into object mode by hitting Tab, and make the object a little bit lower so it doesn't intersect exactly at 0. This will help with our booleans a little bit later down the line. Let's rename this by pressing F2 and say bool box. Make sure that it's toggled off so we don't see it in the render. Now let's go to the object property, so the orange icon over here. And we want to go to visibility, ray visibility, and we want to uncheck all of these. We basically don't want to see the object. In the viewport, display as wire. So now we just see the wire. That will help us visualize what it's doing without getting in the way like you saw here. Currently, I'm in Cycles, render preview, and even if we have something that's set to display as wire, Cycles will display it as solid. Cool, so we have our boolean box. So let's start selecting objects. So we start with path 006, which I'll rename facade. And let's go to the modifiers, add modifier, boolean, set it to fast, click on the bool box. Now let's try to move the bool box so it intersects and see whether it works or not. Cool, and it's working, and it's actually looking really nice even like that, where we expose the full internals but with only a part of the facade. Next, let's click on mass 005, click on bool box, indifference, and now we are missing all the massing. And let's continue now with our floors. So to make this work, we actually need to duplicate our massing. The reason for that is that we'll boolean one of the massings, but we need to keep one intact so we can first get the right footprint of all of our floors. So I've duplicated it, so mass 005 is the same as mass base, and I renamed this one mass base. It has subdivision, but it doesn't have a boolean modifier, whereas mass.005, that one has the boolean modifier. That's the one that we see cut away with the box. Next, if you click on the floors, we've got a few things going on already here, right? So I'll just show you how they're built, because they're very basic and very simple. It's just a simple plane that we array 4.5 meters up, then we solidify it with, let's see what we're using here, 0.5 meter, and then we're using the boolean of the shell to get it in the right place. So it's a completely procedural system, and if we want to change the floor-to-floor height, we can do that very easily. Let's type in 3.3 meters, and you see our floors change. We can add more floors if we want to. Now there's some artifacts. When that occurs, the best thing to do is just to try to move the object up or down by a small amount. And usually those artifacts go away. In this case, it's a precise overlap between the faces of the floors and the face of our massing. So I'm going to put this back to 4.4 meters, contract all these booleans, and now let's create another boolean. Change it to fast, set object bool box. Mass base let's hide that object and make sure that it's also hidden in the render so we don't see it. Great, so we have our base. Let's do the same with our core. I already have a boolean modifier and I just need to put in the correct element, boolean box. And we don't see it because it's completely within the boolean box. So now if we move our boolean box a little, a good view for a section is something like this, where we can see the intersection. So that's the base. So that's looking pretty good already. I don't see my first floor, so I want to change that by slightly moving this up or down, 0.01. There you go, that's better. And you can see that our floors are actually not as wide as this box. So we can click on edit, press 2 to select edges and expand that, and now edit out, and we should have everything covered correctly. Base is done. Next, let's figure out in a smart way how we can get rid of the floors that intersect with our core. Because here we have lifts, and those lifts need to go all the way up and down. They don't need to be confined by our floors. So for that, we'll use geometry nodes. So let's add a modifier, geometry nodes, to the floors, create new, and let's say bool core. Next, open a geometry nodes editor. And in here, we would like to bring in the core object, change position to relative, and now we have the geometry of the core. Next, let's get the bounding box. So click and drag from geometry out and type bounding box. Now we have our bounding box, so we'll use that for boolean. Shift A, search mesh boolean, put that in here and connect bounding box into there, self intersection and hold tolerant. Last time I found out that I have to scale this because you can see like it's working most of the time, but in some cases it's not. And if we go to the real view, it's because everything is intersecting exactly at that edge. So we can transform these boxes slightly so we make them a bit bigger. So let's add a transform node to the bounding box. We want to scale it along this axis, which is the y-axis. So scale to something like 1.05, and that moves it out of the way. So now if we move our bounding boxes, you can see that our floors respond accordingly. So that's a really nice little trick we can do with geometry nodes where, you know, this geometry is not perfect. We've got some gaps in between these. Are they fully solid? Are they not? It doesn't matter, but we can get the bounding box and use that to subtract that floor area out of here. This video is sponsored by my Patreons. Thank you guys so much for enabling me to do what I love doing and for helping you and everybody else on YouTube being able to use Blender for architectural design. And in case you do want to support my work further to enable even more people like yourselves to learn how to use Blender for architectural design, check out my Patreon page. In there, there's behind the scenes, there are files available for a lot of the YouTube videos like this one, and there are also many in-depth guides to use as a reference in addition to the YouTube videos, like again, this one. So the next thing we'll do is add some people. So I have a few asset libraries that I've created with people. These come from Sketchfab. Search for Sketchfab low poly people. Let's see what comes around. Perfect. Yep. So these are the people that I'm using. So you can download them for free. So let's drag a few people in here. So I'll drag in this person and I'll drag in this person. Now the scale is not quite right. I'm not sure if they come from imperial units or so on, but in metric, the person should be about 1.75 to 1.8 meters tall. So I'll grab both of these people and as to scale them up. And I'm just looking at my Z dimensions to see when they hit about the right, something around this. So she's 181, he's 188. So they're a bit too high. So you may notice a custom color, red. This color is very simple. So if we go to shader editor, it's just the color red. And what I found out is that it makes a very nice contrast in this kind of composition that we have. Let's put these two people in their own collection, people 2. So now we have them here. Let's now put them on these faces. For that, we'll do another geometry nodes instance. We can combine them, but I like the very rich flexibility of geometry nodes and using them as modifiers. And we can keep very simple, straightforward functions in their separate ones. So then it's easy to understand what's happening. Let's call this people, geometry node editor. I'm going to bring in the collection. Here you go. Here it is. So the first thing we want to do is distribute points on faces. So search, distribute points on faces. Now the default density is very high, so we want to reduce that to something like 0.01, and we can see the number of points it says here, 43. So that's pretty good. Shift A, search instance on points, drag the geometry into here. Separate children, pick instance, and now we should see our people. Now we have to reset them so they're in the right place. However, the reset also changes their scale. So if we go and click on these two people and we see the scale, you see how this says 1.833 in object space. That means that they've shrunken down to their default one. All we need to do is apply the scale by going to object, apply, scale. And now they've all grown to the right size. But we lost our floor, so let's get them back. So I'll select this object here that we have, our floor object here. All we need is a join geometry. Now we've got our objects. We have another issue though. The people are coming in, or the points where the people are instance, sometimes they're on top, but sometimes they're on the bottom. And I'm sure in some instances, they also come from the sides. Let's increase the density a little bit more, 0.05. We do want to figure out how to have them coming only from the top. So to do that, we need to select only the top faces. So from this incoming geometry here, we want to separate it. Separate geometry, plug that into here, and have that set to face. Now the selection should be a compare node vector. So the first one is going to be normal, and the second one is something that we click on. So we want that to be facing up. So now, if we see what geometry this is, let's turn this off. Let's plug that in here. We should only see the top faces. Why is that happening? Because all of these faces here, they're facing up. So their normal is 0, 0, 1. Whereas the other faces, if we go and see the original, so the faces underneath, they're facing down. So their normal is 0, 0, -1. And with this thing here, what are we doing? So we're separating the geometry based on the normal direction. So on one hand, we have the normals that are coming in from all of our geometry. And on the other hand, we're comparing it to a vector. And we want that vector to be 0, 0, 1. And this becomes a boolean. So it's a positive or negative. So it's a 0 or a 1 basically. And if it's a 1, it's the correct face. If it's 0, it's the incorrect face. So all the ones become the selection, or the inverted one is all the ones on the bottom. And you see now they're all in the wrong place. And I see that on the floors, we have one extra floor that I would like to get rid of. Actually, we have a lot of extra floors, but they're all zooming out. The top floor is kind of this mezzanine floor, which could be double height. It could be quite nice. So the lifts don't even need to go all the way up. Although typically you would need some kind of service room, which is adjacent to the lift at the top, but sometimes it could also be at the bottom. And yes, there would also be some kind of basement in here, I imagine, as well. Now there's another issue which you might see with this kind of shape, and that is that some people are extending out of our massing. So what can we do here? All we need to do is shrink our faces a little bit. So once we separate them, before we distribute the points, let's add scale elements. Note, we want faces and the scale to be something like 0.9. I think that should be good. Now we might clean up most of them, but not all of them. In fact, you see here we have some issues. So in that case, we can then play with the seed of distribute points on faces until we get one that looks about correct and it doesn't intersect with too much of our geometry here. We also have to be conscious of the view that we're picking. Sometimes we might have a view where we won't really see that. All right, so that's pretty good. So now if we go and move this around, we can either have the full building, and we see we now have also more people because that area is not booleaned out. Or if we go in, we have this very nice and still completely procedural element. Now, one last touch that I would like to do here is add a little bit of material, and I'll show you what I've done with these cores. So they're basically an array, right? So we start with something very simple, and I do this all the time, and I think it's the best part of using Blender, right? So we start with a simple box, and it's arrayed 3 times, then it's arrayed however many times, I think 12, yep, 12 floors, and then we separate them. But I've done a very simple geometry just to delineate where the door is. So for that element, we can add a new material. And materials, I'm not very precious about what they are at this point. It's just something that gives us a slight hint that there's a door there. Let's go into edit mode. I'm going to go into wireframe, select faces, select these 2 faces and assign the second material, which we can call door. Let's make it slightly darker. You get the sense that there is something in there, that there are doors. Now these don't align completely with our massing. Wonder why that is. Oh, right. So we changed the floor here. It should be 4 meters. There you go. So now it's 4 meters. All the people in the correct place. All the doors are in the correct place. And we do need an extra floor once again. As a last graphical bit that I like to add is some very simple lifts in there. So it starts with the plane. I'll shrink that down a little bit. In fact, let's go to regular view, regular solid view, to something like this. Go into edit mode. We'll extrude it. Select everything. And we'll add a solidify modifier to a thickness of 0.3. Now I want to apply the scale. So that 0.3 is true. And maybe that should be 0.2. There you go. Now let's add another modifier. Boolean. Set it to fast. Select bool box. So now we're cutting away from here. And let's duplicate this. I'm going to use Alt plus D to duplicate and move this around somewhere in the middle. Also this one here. And let's put a third one somewhere over here. Now let's create a new material. Let's go to material preview mode and change the material to something that's contrasting. It's not too heavy, but it's clearly a different element. So it jumps out at you when you're looking at this. So nobody can confuse the fact that this is a core now. And within here, we can also place our people. So we have our separate collection, which I've turned off. And I'm going to grab one of the people. First, I'm going to put the cursor here. Then with the person selected, Shift S, selection to cursor. And then Shift right click is the hotkey for putting the cursor. Select the second person, Shift S, selection to cursor. Now, as you can see, none of these people moved, even though we moved them here, because in the geometry nodes script, we specified the fact that the location should be reset and that any of the transforms that we have should be reset. Great. So we're pretty much done here. In regards to the setup, I'm using cycles with everything more or less default. Of course, with denoise checked on. And I'm using very high contrast in color management. Now, if you go to shader editor, world, it's fairly simple. It's just a sky texture, but I mix it in with the background. So we have a white background instead of the sky background to see the difference. So that kind of background is not very suitable for architectural diagrams. So that's why we have a white background, which is determined by the light path and if it's a camera ray, and then that gets mixed in here. And we can play with the sun rotation to see whether they're different angles that work well. Usually these kinds of angles where we see shadows from a little bit of the facade and the core work quite well to accent the sense of depth in there. To render this out, we'll add a new camera, Shift A, camera. Let's go to the camera settings and we'll change this camera from perspective to orthographic and change the scale to something like 150. That might be too big. Let's select the camera and let's go to camera view here. To make it true isometric, we want to rotate this to increments of 45 and the rotation in the X should be 54.7. Now we need to position this a little bit further away from our object so it's not getting cropped. So let's move the camera somewhere else and I will rotate it 180 by pressing R and then 180. Let's go to here just to see how it looks. Now let's go back to the camera view. Now it depends on whether we want to see both or not. In this case, I will only want to focus on the section cut so we can even turn off the building. And let's hide the bool box. That's the right angle. So now we can play with the orthographic scale. Let's try 100. Once it's done, press F12 to render out. I'm using slightly higher settings than the default ones. If we go to output properties, I have increased the default HD resolution to 150%, the original. So it might take a little bit longer to render. So once we have the final image, Alt S to save. I'll call this image 03 because I have a few in there already. And we'll process this image a little bit in Affinity Designer. So what I like to do is add a really nice and strong outline to accent the fact that this is a section cut. Now you can spend a lot of time on it or you can be fairly quick in doing it. In this case, I'm just picking the floor to floor. Now this area here might look a little bit better with a bit more definition. And then we continue with the rest. And once we have the outline, let's make it a bit thicker. And we're ready with our section. Of course, if we want to, we can add a lot more graphics in here, like floor levels, put in color boxes based on functions. For example, maybe those first couple of floors are one kind of function, and then we have a second kind of function here at the top. And then you see I'm drawing these a little bit loosely because we can separate these now. So if we click on the Shape Builder 2 in Affinity, so this is Affinity Designer 2, and it has this new very nice feature called Shape Builder. So first we have to select all of our curves, and then let's click on here, enter, and here, enter. So now we've got these two areas, so we can turn off these helper curves. And with these two areas here, we can change our settings. We can use a color, and we can have one color in one area and then another color in the other area. We can also control, maybe we just want that to be, and let's turn on our original curve on. So that's it. What do you think about this process? Let me know in the comments. If you're interested to know how to build this shape in Blender, let me know in the comments. If you're interested to see more videos about more diagrammatic representations with Blender, also do let me know in the comments. File, as always, is available on Patreon. And see you guys next time.